And we've got video. That's awesome. And I will go ahead and share the whole screen. Okay. And yep, it's recording. So we're good. Okay. So back to Blackboard. All right. So if you lose your paper copy of the syllabus or you're just like on the go and need to reference it, I do this sometimes when I'm like, you know, not near my computer, but I need to check the syllabus. Just do it here. So you can see the whole thing here. Here is, and I've sent a couple of you this as well, how you're supposed to be able to get your Connect synced up with our class. It's not working for everybody, unfortunately. So if you're having issues, there is customer support here. Apparently they're mixed on whether they're helpful or not. So, you know, our IT people might be able to help you. And if it continues to be an issue, let me know and I can contact them. Hopefully I have a little more weight, who knows? Here is the info for Zoom. So if you are sick or if you are, you know, traveling, I had last year, some of my athletes sign on from the bus. You don't have to do that. They just didn't want to miss class. So they went ahead and signed on. So it's certainly an option, not required. I've got the non-discrimination statement here, and also just I post these in every class. These are group norms for discussion. This comes from the office of the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities, who did a workshop for the faculty a few years ago. So, you know, one person talking at a time, using I statements rather than like you, blah, 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 like I feel. Maintaining confidentiality. So we'll talk about some stuff that's pretty personal in here, right? And you don't have to self-disclose anything that's super personal, but if someone does, I just ask that you keep it confidential within our class. I also ask that you don't talk about, like, especially your roommate or something like that. We're a pretty small campus, so people will figure out who that is pretty quickly, right? So just maintaining confidentiality. Practice purity of motive means don't assume that someone's being malicious if they say something that is offensive. You know, kind of poke it. Sometimes people say stuff that's malicious, but a lot of times people might be speaking from a place of ignorance, for example. And that's where number 5 comes in. And I'll try to always be the one that does this, sort of an ouch, like, ooh, that's hurtful, and here's why. Right? But if I miss something, y'all are definitely free to jump in with this. So I'll give you an example. And this was an upper level class several years ago. I just had a student who firmly believed that you could just solve depression and anxiety by going for a walk outside. No, right? I mean, if you're having really mild cases and walking outside is really beneficial to you, it'll help, right? And it certainly will help in general, but some people are going to need medication. Most people are going to need therapy, right? So I had to do this because a lot of those students in my class struggled with depression and anxiety, and it really hurt them, right, to hear that. Share the air, so make sure that people are getting a chance to speak, and then take responsibility for what you say, not only what you say, but how you say it. So, and again, this is something I'm always working on. I was on a meeting of a bunch of psychologists and said, you know, when we're in that space, it feels claustrophobic. And I was like, I'm really sorry, that's stigmatizing language. I shouldn't be saying it like that, right? It's not a disorder just because you feel squished in one time, right? So things along those lines. All the steps for your myth infographic is here. Good morning, including that link to how you see the whole book about the myths. My lecture notes are here. And the first 3 book chapters are here. If you're like waiting for your book to come, you can get chapters 1 and 2 here. And then you'll see I have both the PowerPoint and the PDF for every chapter. As I mentioned the other day, I talk kind of quickly. This can really help people to follow along. So you can print them out if you're someone who likes to take hand notes, or like I see many of you with your laptops, you can just type in as you follow along. Here is where you'll be able to link to all those Connect assignments. Here is where the Explain It to the Media quizzes will show up when I have them created. Some of the ones I wrote full disclosure, it was like fall 2016. A lot was going on in my life, a lot was going on in the world, and they're not very good questions. So I'm trying to revamp them and make them more interesting. So here's where you'll turn in those psychology experience credits as you engage in studies or summarize articles. And then you'll be able to see your grades here. And there are links to things like the bookstore, the library, things along those lines. So I try to set up our Blackboard page to be as helpful as possible and get us all on the same page. And so then the last thing I did want to do real quick before we dive in today is to look at the chart on the back of the syllabus, just because we kind of ran out of time, and just sort of reiterate how things are going. So we'll cover each chapter for 3 to 4 days of class, and we will do various activities during those 3 to 4 days, essentially when we get to that point. And then usually the first or second day that we cover something, that Connect Learn Smart module will be due. The Connect Learn Smart module, if you haven't gone through them yet, they also call it Smart Book now. It basically walks you through the whole book. So if you're someone who you'd rather just look through a chapter once, it might be good to just try that first before going and reading the ebook chapter. Some people really benefit from that repetition, so feel free to read and then do that. Then you'll have some fun interactive assignments. They're usually like activities you do or a video you watch and answer some multiple choice questions about. And then explain it to the media quiz. And remember, again, these are deadlines I highly suggest so that you're following along and you benefit from it. But if something comes up, you're gonna have to turn it in late. You don't even have to email me, just turn it in late, okay? But keep on top of things, because if you try to do all of this week, when you're also trying to catch up for all your other classes, it's not gonna be a fun time, right? So, but I do wanna give you all that flexibility. So we're gonna start with an overview of psychology as a field. We'll talk about research methods to really focus in on that second part of the objectives that we talked about on Monday. And then we'll get into our topics. We'll cover motivation and emotion, gender, sex, and sexuality, personality, social psych, industrial and organizational, which is where you can make a lot of money if you're in psychology, disorders, therapies, and then our last chapter covers health psychology, which is really a growing field, and a lot of people are benefiting from this, the integration of psychology into physical health setting, whether it's primary care clinics, or a lot of what I did while I was in grad school was actually rounding in the hospitals and seeing people bedside. So wanted to make sure we're all on the same page there. And now what I'm going to do is actually call roll. If I butcher your name, please correct me. I was a really shy kid and we moved when I was in like 4th grade. And for a year, everyone called me Torrid instead of Taryn. And I didn't say anything because I was just, it was fine, everything's fine. It wasn't fine, right? My parents finally had to correct them at parent-teacher conferences. Please correct me. I want to say your name right. Okay, so Mia Barnes. Awesome. Alrighty. Deja. Nora. Abby. Monica. Awesome. Sarah Ellis. Awesome. Miriam. Okay, awesome. Lauren. And Micaiah. Right. Yes, I wrote out the phonetics for myself. So, Lyric. Onyx. India. Any India here today? Oh, she's on. That's right. She told me she was going to be here on Zoom. Hey, India. Thank you. Jalen. All right. Daria? Is it Daria or Daria? Yeah. Okay. I think I'm just writing it out phonetically for myself. Okay. Ray. Heaven. Sydney. Alex. Sarah. Melissa. Awesome. Linda. Okay. Antoinette. Jenna. Jenna did her meeting with me already this morning, so I know her name because I've seen her face without the mask. Sequoia. Okay. And Grayson. Awesome. Thank you all. So I'll probably do that for the first week or so until I learn your names, and then I'll just sort of check you off as you walk in. But alrighty, so what I'm gonna do is go ahead and put this in slideshow mode. And then the really cool thing you can do with Google Slides is that you can turn on captions. And so they're not perfect, but you'll see as I talk, it actually puts down what I'm saying. So if you're someone who struggles because you usually use a lot of lip reading cues, this might be really helpful to you as I talk with the mask on. So, all right, so today we're gonna start doing an overview of what psychology is. And I know, especially since this is 102, a lot of this will be like old news to a lot of you, right? A lot of you have taken 101 or maybe taken psych in high school, right? So this might be sort of, okay, whatever. But I still think it's always good to sort of regroup, ground ourselves in what is the history of psychology, what is psychology supposed to be about, and then sort of what has it become. So psychology is about studying, diagnosing, and treating abnormal, distressing, impairing behavior. That's what we tend to think, right? When you tell someone, oh, I'm majoring in psychology, what do they usually say? People have this happen. Oh, are you analyzing me right now? Right?
I had that happen to me at work the other day.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, let me be careful with what I say.
Right. I always tell people my brain turns off, right? Or people will be like, oh, you can come help me with my kids. Like, nope, sorry. Right. So people tend to think psychology is only about abnormality, disorders, and therapy. And sure, we're going to cover that for a few chapters this semester, right? But it's about so much more. And a lot of what we do in psychology is really trying to apply basic principles and figure out why people or animals do the things they do. And then in a lot of cases, how we can take that knowledge and use it to benefit people, animals, groups of people, etc. So psychology is about how we perceive information, right? So this doesn't always work as well on the projector, but sometimes when people look at this, it looks like it's moving. It's not, right? It is just a static image. I promise it's not a GIF or a GIF or however you want to pronounce it. Right? Some people will see black dots moving around here. Again, there are no black dots, they're all white, but our minds like to kind of mess with us, and depending on the other information we get, we may perceive things in a different way. And I think especially for this second half of intro psych, where we're talking about a lot of the applied things, like how are we using psychology in a work setting, right? How do people's personalities are they influenced? It's really important to keep this abstract idea in mind that like different people looking at the exact same thing can see it completely different ways, right? And that's really important because I think a lot of times we're like, I remember a friend of mine once, very well-meaning, very liberal person just being like, well, people just can't think that way. They just can't. And I was like, no, conservative people do think that way. Like, you know, it's just people, depending on their background, their influences, will perceive the exact same situation in different ways. So psychology is also about how we interpret that information when we get there. All right, so imagine you're walking, let's say, through Baton, and you see one of your friends pass you, and she doesn't look at you or say anything to you. What are some of the reasons why? What does your mind say? What's happening there? Why did she say hi? she's mad at me, right? Like a lot of us will jump to like, what did I do, right? What else? What else might go through your mind? Right? Yeah. They're upset. Yeah. And it might just be, she didn't see me, right? Or maybe she's having a bad day and is so distracted, right? And so how we interpret that information is going to influence how we behave, how we feel, right? If I think she's mad at me, I did something wrong, I'm going to be paranoid the rest of the day, right? Like, what did I do? You're overanalyzing everything, right? But, you know, it could just be she's having a bad day herself. So how we interpret, how we think about that information is going to influence a lot of what we do and how we feel. So it's also about how we remember things. So go ahead and look at these words, and I'm just going to count for 10 seconds of silence in my head. Okay, so write down all the words you can remember. Ignore the bottom part of this. It should have come up. Since it came up, normally these are supposed to appear one at a time. This was a conversion to Google Docs issue. A lot of people will write down the word needle even though it wasn't there because all the other words on the list are sort of needle adjacent. So they're things like sharp and point and sewing. So our mind will say, well, obviously needle should have been there, right? Because all these other words are related to that. It's also about how we learn things, right? So what do you all think? Why do kids throw temper tantrums? What's that? Yeah, they're frustrated. A lot of times, especially when they're little, they don't have the words to say what they need. They might not understand their emotions. Why else might they throw tantrums?
Yeah, because they did it once before and they got what they wanted. Every time they get what they want.
Exactly. So this is a basic principle called reinforcement. And sometimes we as adults or other people inadvertently reinforce bad behavior because we give in. I saw this great tweet last week where someone said, my roommate says my cat keeps waking her up in the middle of the night meowing and she gives him treats every time. And I just like don't know how to break it to her. I was like, you're reinforcing that behavior by doing it, right? And so this can happen with kids in classes too. So think about kids who act out. Maybe they have attention deficit issues. Maybe they just act out, right? They're more likely to get attention from the teacher in a lot of scenarios. So they'll keep acting out. Even if it's negative attention, it's still attention. So looking at this, so we take the water from B and we pour it into C. Which glass has more water in it? They're the same. Yeah. Yeah. And you all know that because you understand properties of conservation. That just because you pour something into something that's shaped differently doesn't mean there's more or less of it unless you mess up and spill, right? But little kids would say there's more in C because it looks taller, right? So there are different stages where we learn these things. It's also how we solve problems. So we as people and some animals are really good at problem solving. So this was a classic experiment where they hung some bananas and they gave these chimps a bunch of crates, and the chimps eventually figured out if I stacked the crates up, I can kind of use it as a ladder to get to the bananas. And you might think chimps share 98% of our DNA. Of course they could do that, right? Well, hopefully this video will work. Looks like it.
I've been getting paid $1,000 a month, if not more,
Sure you
just
are.
from this app on my phone.
All right, so this is a pigeon. We tend to think pigeons aren't necessarily the smartest creatures, right? But let's see what the pigeon does here. There we go. So it's trying to figure it out. And just so you're not like, why isn't it flying? What they do is they clip the wings Doesn't hurt the pigeon, they actually just clip the feathers, but so it can't fly. So, it's taken it a while, but it also took the chimps a while. Oh, if I stand on this, I'm taller. Okay, what do I do now? Maybe starting to figure it out here. Oh, not quite. And boom. Yeah. So again, it took it a minute, but again, we think of pigeons as they're these quote unquote stupid creatures, right? Oh, hang on just a sec. Let me make sure that's not on autoplay. There we go. But in fact, a lot of creatures can and do engage in problem solving. And in fact, not pigeons in particular, but there's a type of bird called a New Chaldean crow that can do a lot of the same things that we see animals we think of as really smart, like dolphins and elephants doing. It can use tools. It will like trim down branches to create its own tool. And it can, if you give it like a puzzle to solve, little bird puzzle where you have to peck things, it can do that too. But the biggest part of psychology that I think most people end up really interested in, and what we're going to focus on in this section mostly, in 102, is why people do what they do, right? So why is achievement really important for some people and not for others? Some people get upset if they get an A-. Some people are like thrilled to get a C, right? Why? Why people choose different professions. Why people do things that are dangerous not only to themselves and others, like drinking and driving, right? So we think about motivation. That's a big part of what we'll talk about here. So psychology is the scientific study of behavioral and mental processes. So the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. So we're looking at observable behavior, things like we don't know what the pigeon's thinking, right? We don't have little like pigeon brain scanners where we can just be like, UPC, this is the thought the pigeon's having, right? But we can observe its behavior and make inferences based on that. So a lot of the goals of psychology end up being to try to describe that behavior. And behavior, I should back up for just a second, is any action we do. So it's any action we can observe and record. So it can be talking, it can be something as simple as smiling, it can be blinking, it can be yelling, it can be dancing, any behavior that a person or an animal can do. And then mental processes are those internal subjective experiences that people have. And when we're dealing with people, particularly adults, we can often try to ask them about their thoughts. Not everyone has great insight into how they're or what they're thinking, right? But we can certainly ask. But a lot of times we're looking at adults, animals, kids, and we're inferring those mental processes, those thoughts from their behavior. So there's how they're sensing and perceiving things, dreams. We think about like dream interpretation, right? Beliefs that people have, feelings. And scientific study here, we'll talk more about in chapter 2, but it's basically a way of asking and answering questions. So you're doing that in a systematic way. You're not just like, well, let's see what happens if I do this to one person, right? You're thinking of it in what is a way I can answer this question in a really thoughtful way. So our goals of psychology are try to describe behavior. This is where we always have to start, right? If we don't know anything about an animal, a person, whatever, we can't just start by explaining what they're thinking, right? We have to like describe what they're doing first. Then we try to explain behavior. And sometimes one of the most important things we try to do is predict future behavior. So in therapy, we might be wanting to predict whether someone is going to harm themselves or somebody else, right? As a therapist, you're not only ethically but legally obligated to protect that person and society, right? So if this person tells me they've been having thoughts of harming someone else, can we make a contract where they say they won't harm that person between now and the next time I see them? Or am I pretty convinced they're gonna go out and actually harm that person, right? In that case, you can try to involuntarily hospitalize them, or there's what's called the Tarasoff rule, which is one of the few times you can break confidentiality and actually contact the person they're going to harm and warn them. And then we try to use those findings in practical ways. So again, we tend to think of these practical ways as like therapy, but psychologists are applying these in lots of different ways. So study skills, teaching things in the best way possible. Things like making workers more productive at their jobs, right? Prevention. A lot of the literature in mental health now is trying to work towards prevention. Instead of waiting till someone's quote unquote bad enough to come in and get therapy, what can we do to try to help them before those symptoms ever get that bad? All right, so we're going to start talking about the history of psychology now. We won't get through the whole thing today. We'll keep talking about this on Monday. But it's important to sort of think about how did our science start and how has it evolved? So psychology is actually a pretty young discipline. So if we think about fields like biology, even things like chemistry, physics, they've been around since at least, 1400s, 1600s, something like that. The first psychology lab was established in 1879, 1879. Okay, so that sounds like a long time ago, but relative to the other sciences, we're pretty young, right? We're like 150 years old. So there's probably more we don't know than we do know in psychology, to be honest. The ideas about psychology or about the mind and why people do what they do did exist before that, though. So many early philosophers, for example, wondered about how the mind works. So for example, in 500 BCE in India, Buddha pondered how sensations and perceptions combine to form ideas. And in Israel, Hebrew scholars tried to figure out how to link thoughts and emotions in the body. We weren't always accurate though with these, right? So for example, the Egyptians thought the brain was an organ of no consequence. And when they mummified people, even though they preserved a lot of the organs, they would just take the brain out and throw it away, right? Took a while to figure that out. Some people would say we think with our hearts and feel with our bowel. Even in Shakespeare, there are times where he refers to like feeling something in your stomach or your kidneys or your spleen, and I thought that's where emotions were. We also had physiologists who were trying to look at behaviors and the physicality of behaviors and how that might actually relate to what's going on in the mind. And so basically, psychology ended up being this combination of physiology and of philosophy. And a lot of the early psychologists in the late 1800s started in philosophy departments. So essentially, if you talk to our philosophers now, philosophers are still sort of pondering a lot of the same issues psychologists are. They just sort of look at it from a different perspective. And we are really looking at it scientifically, whereas philosophers are sort of sitting back and thinking big picture. So some famous names that you probably have heard of in other courses, right? So Socrates, he was in like 400s BCE, and then his student Plato as well, concluded that the mind is separable from the body. They thought the mind continued after the body dies. So sort of our modern conception of a soul is how they thought of the mind. They also thought knowledge was innate, that you were born with all the knowledge you needed. There are some innate things that we know, and there are really cool reflexes that babies have, for example, that are really adaptive. But in general, this is not the case, right? We know that people learn things. Y'all are learning things at this moment, right? Aristotle, who was Plato's student, said that the soul and the body are not separable. And he said knowledge is not innate. So already you had people arguing against their teachers, and that's something we'll certainly see in the personality section. So like Freud is the person we tend to think of when we think of personality, but like almost every one of his disciples went against him. We're like, nah, yeah.
You said Socrates and Plato believed that?
Yes, Socrates and Plato believed that the mind was separable, and then Aristotle came in and said it's not. Yeah, good
Just wanted to
question.
make sure.
Yep, always feel free to clarify for things like that. So Aristotle acknowledged that your knowledge grows from experiences. And he started to really have a conceptualization of memory as a storage unit as well. By the way, if you want to see like one of the best pop culture portrayals of how memory works, Inside Out. They actually worked with psychologists, in particular Paul Ekman, who also consulted on Lie to Me, a show about microexpressions. And so a lot of what they do in Inside Out is based on modern neuroscience and what we know about the brain. Okay, so we had these Greek philosophers, the Romans as well. And then unfortunately, there was like this period of 2,000 years where we had very few enduring insights into human nature. Now, sidestep, thinking about what we were talking about on Monday in terms of how we tend to focus on white male voices, right? And often westernized voices. In indigenous cultures worldwide, they had their own conceptualizations of the mind, the body, abnormality. So some cultures thought that people who had mental illnesses, like it was a sign they were connecting spiritually with whatever gods that they believed in. Some people believed they had to do like an exorcism to get rid of it. Okay, so there were lots of different ways that this was being thought about in the meantime. It just wasn't being published about. So then you had Rene Descartes. And so he was alive from 1595 to 1650. And he argued that the mind is distinct from the body as well. And so he dissected animals, and he thought that the fluid in the brain, what we would now call cerebrospinal fluid, right, contains animal spirits that flowed through our nerves and muscles to cause movement. I mean, he wasn't that far off if we think about like neurons and how they send messages to the muscles, right? But it doesn't just like flow through us like water. Right? So these guys, again, were trying, and Descartes was trying to like apply the science as well. Okay, so here we'll get to some of these ancient ideas I was just referencing. So since there have been people, there have been mental illnesses. And since there have been mental illnesses, people have been trying to figure out why, right? Like it might not have been a formal study, but people were always trying to explain it. So it was seen as the work of evil spirits in a lot of times, maybe demons or ghosts. And when a person acted oddly, they were possessed by those evil spirits. And there are still people who believe this today. For those of you who are sophomores and above, I don't know if anyone went to the Nussbaum Center talk last year where they had an exorcist come in. Really interesting. He also has a PhD in psychology. Kind of, yeah, it was sort of hard to wrap my head around, to be perfectly honest. But he believes that exorcisms are still helpful. Cool, he includes it as part of his clinical practice. All right, right? Like again, maybe I shouldn't judge. Maybe one day we'll figure out that, you know, the power of prayer, maybe not specifically for an exorcism, but in general, is healing in specific ways, right? But it's sort of interesting to think about. One of the ways that they did focus on removing evil spirits was what was called trephination, and that's what you see on this skull here. They would actually drill holes in people's skulls to try to release these evil spirits. Yeah. So we're thinking ancient times, they may have had some like pain controlling herbs, right? But they didn't have modern anesthesia, right? And they also didn't have modern antibiotics. So you can imagine for some people this was fine, but others may have gotten infections and passed not too long after that. But to them, they weren't harming the person, they were trying to help them, right? And in exorcisms themselves, it's often some sort of religious figure, a shaman, a priest, what have you, who recites prayers, maybe performs magic, might even give the person herbal concoctions to try to rid the body of evil spirits. The first known psychiatric text that we have was from ancient Egypt, and it describes hysteria. So hysteria comes from the root word hyster, Hyster, which means uterus. And so this was an idea the Egyptians had and the Greeks ended up taking on as well. And unfortunately, variations of this included and kind of still were thought of until the early 1900s. But the idea was that your uterus would up and wander around your body. So if you were like having some sort of speech difficulties, your uterus might be lodged in your throat. If you were having like paralysis or numbness in your arm that wasn't explained for physical reasons, because your uterus is hanging out in your shoulder. We know that's not true, right? But it also meant that for years and years, with this being one of the like leading ideas about mental illness, women were stigmatized much more than men, right? Because they have uteruses. And eventually in the 1800s into early 1900s, we were also diagnosing men with this. And just still using the term. Nowadays, we use terms like somatoform disorders that basically just mean your body's stress is being physically manifested in these ways, right? But it's really sort of interesting to think about, again, these biases that existed, right? That still kind of trickled on today. It's still the case that people will use hysterical against people in general, but particularly women, right, who are like often rightfully upset about something, right? And it's still the case that women are diagnosed more often than men. And there are two sides to why this is bad, right? One is that we know men do not seek therapy at the same rate women do, even when they need it, right? So oftentimes we won't see, I'll give you an example. When I worked at the VA for a year, this was in 2010, and we had veterans from Vietnam, so from the 60s and 70s, who were just coming in to get their PTSD treated because they had just gone through treatment for addiction. And they basically been self-medicating for years, kind of keeping all the symptoms down with either alcohol, drugs, a combination. And then when they finally got that under control, then their symptoms came out. But here you think these people were suffering for like 40 years, right, not getting diagnosed. And then again, sometimes women are over stigmatized, and people who are non-binary. I mean, we can get into all sorts of conversations about that and how much they're stigmatized, right? And so this is something we need to kind of keep in mind as we go through things: is what's normal, what's abnormal, what do we label as different or problematic, right? So the manual we use to diagnose people, it's called the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. There's a whole section for what they call culture-bound disorders. And probably not surprisingly to anyone in this room, they're all non-Western cultures, right? There might be Asian cultures, island cultures, things along those lines. People within my field, eating disorders, actually advocated to argue that bulimia nervosa is a culture-bound disorder because we've only found it in Western cultures or in Eastern cultures that have been exposed to Western media. And they were like, no, 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 that's not a thing, right? So again, these biases influence the conversations about these things. In ancient China, they thought the human body had both a positive and a negative force, and that mental illness would come out when those were not in balance. And so this is sometimes articulated as the yin and the yang, right? I was in high school in the late 90s, and that was just like trendy jewelry you wore, right? But in fact, it has a deep spiritual meaning for some folks. One of the typical ways that they would heal people is to starve them in order to deplete someone of excessive force and to try to create harmony again. Those same type of ideas we saw again in Greek and Roman times, but again continued throughout. If you've ever read literature from like the Victorian area, England, for example, they'll talk about bleeding people when they were sick, right? Yeah, and so this goes into ideas about mental disorders that really came about in the Greek and Roman times and hung around. And some of these terms are terms we still use. So melancholia, unshakable sadness, right? We still use melancholy. Mania, we still talk about manic episodes, the mania part of bipolar disorder, what used to be called manic depression. So this is euphoria and frenzied activity. Dementia is a term that they came up with back then, and they just meant general intellectual decline. We talked about good old hysteria, right? How that's still around. But they used it for a physical element with no apparent physical cause. Delusions, they came up with the idea of delusions, so fixed false beliefs. And then hallucinations. Imagine sights and sounds as if they were real. So again, some of these terms that were being thought up of centuries ago, we still use variations of today. So Hippocrates is someone you've probably heard of, the Hippocratic Oath, right? Doctors still take. So he really is considered the founder of modern medicine. And he and his associates left a body of work called the Hippocratic Corpus, in which they suggested that psychological or mental disorders could be treated like any other disease. They thought that the psychological disorders could be caused by brain pathology, head trauma, or influenced by genetics. They might not use the term genetics, but they talk about it running in families, right? So they had a lot of early ideas that resonate with stuff that we're like just circling back around to today. Right? I mean, the fact that it's only been what, maybe 2 decades, not even, since we came up with the idea of CTE, when you get multiple concussions, whether that be in the battlefield or as we've studied it the most on the football field, right? But like back in the day, they were already talking about head trauma causing issues, right? And then they considered the brain to be the seat of wisdom, consciousness, intelligence, and emotions. They said, that's why they said, so consciousness, intelligence, emotions, all those things are in the brain. So if any of those things is off in someone, it's because there's a problem in the brain. Again, like seems logical to us now, was revolutionary at the time. Again, remember, not too long before this, Egyptians were just discarding the brain because it didn't matter. And so they came up with the idea of the 4 humors. And so this is really similar to the idea of the yin and yang. We just added 2 more. And so they thought that if any of these were out of balance in your body, that's what would cause not only mental illness, but physical illness. So if you had too much blood, that could cause moodiness. And this is where for mental reasons as well as physical reasons, they would bleed people. They literally cut people and like put bowls under them. And it was, as you can imagine, like they would do this to people with fevers. Didn't go very well. A lot of those people perished, unfortunately. But they were, again, at the time, they thought they were doing cutting edge treatment and were going to help people. Phlegm. They thought if you had too much phlegm, it would cause fatigue. And then there were 2 types of bile. If you had too much yellow bile, it would cause depression. And if you had too much black bile, it would lead to anxiety or aggression. So again, these ideas were really held till not that long ago, 1800s, things along those lines. So why I told you all this cool stuff that like the Egyptians a little bit, but also the Greeks and the Romans came up with, why did it take us so long to circle back around to it? Well, the Middle Ages, which are sometimes called the Dark Ages, there was a growing distrust of science. I'm vaguely familiar to right now, right? I don't think we're in the Middle Ages, but there is a sort of anti-science pushback in our society that's concerning right now, right? So that led to a resurgence basically of those ideas from ancient times, that abnormality was caused by some sort of evil spirits, and now because the majority of people were Christian, it was embodied by Satan, right? He was causing mental illness. So during the Middle Ages, there was on average one church for every 200 people. Religion was a really important part of people's lives. There were ideas about mass madness that came around. So tarantism, people would like get together and they jump and they dance and they convulse, and eventually this became the dance, the tarantella. People would dance and shout and rave and jump in patterns, and this is where we get the idea of a rave, like parties at night now. And people often, I gotta tell you about lycanthropy. So werewolfism, people thought they were wolves or acted like wolves. And then witchcraft, particularly outspoken women were often punished, killed, or women with mental illness were seen as witches and burned at the stake. And we had a famous witch around here, actually, the Witch of Pungo, Grace Sherwood. So if you've heard of Witch Duck Road, that's named after her. And if you drive by some Terra Independence, there's actually a statue of her in front with some animals around her. Yeah.
The Fairy Plantation House, over on, I believe it's off Independence. It is where she's actually tried. It used to be old courthouse.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's awesome.
It's also haunted. It's really cool. I would bring you up.
Very cool. Yeah, so there's all these little hidden secrets around here, right? Yeah, and so we know about Salem, right? But we had it in Virginia. I think like she was pardoned by Tim Kaine when he was governor in like the early 2000s.
No,
Like,
she was recently.
was it recent? Okay. But yeah, so, and again, she was just like a lady who used herbal remedies, but like that was witchcraft, right? And then it seems really odd now to think about mass madness and things like that. But in 1992, which sounds like a long time ago, but it's really not in the grand scheme of things, right? There were 21 people at a school who had to be rushed to the hospital after one girl said she smelled something coming from a vent, and they all had dizziness, headaches, nausea, and stomach pain. And there was no physical cause, and they never actually found anything in the vent. So it still happens today. Alrighty, everybody have a great weekend, and I will pick back up here on Monday.